Spain around the year 1999. That was something that I started working after I saw, when I was a student in New York City at Columbia University, I saw there was a course on women and planning, on women and architecture, that's what it was. And I became interested in it. And then when I was able to start my independent research, so I started working on it. That was over 20 years ago. And this work around like 4 years ago, the UNESCO recognized it with the creation of the chair, which is the only chair of there's like a dozen UNESCO chairs that address gender issues, but this is the only one that is located in a technological university across the world. So it's the only one that really addresses technological planning or architectural issues within a technological university, and not from a sociological point of view or from the humanities, which are what most of the gender UNESCO chairs do. So the activities that we do in the UNESCO chair are the ones that you can see in the screen. We do research, we do dissemination and advocacy and engagement. We do consultancy and technical assistance. We do obviously education and also professional training and strategic expert advice to both public organizations and private enterprises. And then we also do some support for professional women. And we do these kind of activities in our fields, which is planning, obviously, architecture, housing, transport and mobility, service and policy design, international cooperation, science and technology, which is mostly to promote women in those fields, and structural change of organizations for supporting the careers of professional women, climate change and innovation and industrial design. So these are the things that we do. This is our team. And let me now, what I intend to give to do today is some sort of let me see if I can, of a brief introduction to what we do and also to how we approach gender in planning. And so what I started to do when I started working on this field, I started looking at what concepts and ideas and topics gender research had brought to light that could be relevant in our fields, in the fields of city building and architectural design, and then all the related areas like housing and transportation and so on. So from the gender research that had been developed since the 1970s, mostly from the US. So the big bulk of research on gender comes from the US and also from Europe too, but the early research comes from American universities. So I found that these key topics that you can see on the screen were particularly relevant for planning and city building and city design. The first thing is gender stereotypes and social norms. So it is how women and men do or are expected to do certain things because those are like expected behaviors that are related, obviously, that have spatial implications. And of course, this is related to gender roles. So what do men and women, because of their gender roles, what are the tasks that they do on their daily lives, and what are the spatial implications of these tasks? This is related, obviously, to what is called the sexual division of labor and the double workload that statistically it's women who assume it, and related to the division of labor between the productive and what are called the productive and the reproductive spheres, which means that statistically, and even if the numbers are changing a little bit, and the gender gap is decreasing a little bit, it is not really decreasing so much, so that women do most of what is called care work, which has become so obvious during this coronavirus crisis, as people have had to isolate in their homes and take care of all the tasks of caring for people. The care task, which is defined as the paid and mostly unpaid work. Some of these, and depending on the country and how social services and private services are organized, some of these, particularly for instance in Scandinavian countries, is paid work produced as public services. But in most countries, it is not paid. Paid and mostly unpaid work performed by adult individuals on behalf of children, the elderly, the sick, and the overall functioning of the household. So this care work has to do with escorting kids to school, doing household errands, buying for groceries and needed daily things for daily living, not buying for clothes or buying things that might not be needed essentials, but buying for things that you really need for daily living. Accompanying people to elderly or young people who cannot move autonomously in the city to medical facilities, to educational facilities, to extracurricular activities, anything that is needed for daily living. That implies moving around the city, going to specific places where certain services are provided, and so on. And so this is mostly women who do it. You can see it in this scheme, which is quite simplified, but this can take quite complex travel patterns, and we will go in a second to transportation implications to this. And this is mostly, statistically, this is women's tasks, and this is confirmed by the time spent caring for children. Those are data from Europe, but American data show similar gender gaps in who takes care of all these activities that imply a very different use of the city and different travel patterns also around the city. And so you see how this domestic work plus employment in the case of women implies all this complex use of the city, while statistically people who don't take care of the care tasks have a simpler way of moving around the city that is more it's more of a commuting pattern and less complex use of the city. So bringing all these concepts that were developed within gender studies into planning really gets to look at what are the implicit gender assumptions that have been used in the construction of our discipline and of our institutional practices and our professional practices. If we look at the foundations of modern city planning, and which basically is still, even if much criticized since the 1960s, it is still much used in the way that actual institutions, planning institutions work, in what we teach our students, in what really professional practice is, even with all the nuances that we can bring to this. But this is still very much the core of planning, the four functions of the cities that is translated into the zoning techniques. And there are some underlying assumptions in this way of looking at cities. It's a personal experience of those living the city without little care responsibility, because the main focus is on paid employment. Housing is considered as leisure and not a place of care. And transport is conceived as the means to link the spaces assigned to housing and employment as a priority, and less to look at all the other more complex interrelationships that derive from care activities. So there are these unconscious ideas that very often are unquestioned and unconscious on gender roles and sexual divisions of labor that are implicit in planning. here I bring this this cartoon. It's already from the 1970s, this cartoon. Oh no, the 1990s, sorry, this cartoon that shows what underlies the construction of the way cities have been built in the post-war period, particularly the American suburb, which has been so nicely analyzed from this point of view by Dolores Hiding from Yale University in her books. There's this implicit conception that the realities and the needs of the persons who take these care responsibilities are not made explicit, and then they don't carry the same attention or priority in policy making or in planning or on investment decisions. If we look more particularly to transportation, we see there has been a lot of research on women's transportation and gender in transportation from a very empirical point of view, maybe because transportation you can quantify it, so it's quite easy to look at it in a numerical form, which the empirical studies that are so prevalent here in the US make it have supported particularly gender analysis and women's and women's patterns of mobility here in the so there's quite a lot of research on this area, and all this research points to overall that quite consistent gender differences in transportation. Men travel longer distances. Women use more different transportation modes because they have less access to a private car, because they have less economic capacity, and also culturally there are, depending on the country, there are limitations of accessing to private cars. Women travel for more different purposes because related to all these care tasks that I was mentioning before. They do more trips, again, because of these different purposes and tasks that they do on a daily basis. The spatial patterns of trips is quite different because men's mobility is more commuting, long distance, and women's mobility is in a shorter spatial area, closer to the home, more polygonally shaped, is because women do more chain trips, meaning that they do one segment of one trip for one purpose, then they do another segment of the trip for another purpose, and sometimes these chain trips are not properly studied or researched in the survey, in the transportation service or transportation literature, and in transportation policy making as a result, and very often sometimes different segments of these trips are made in different transportation modes. Some are made on bus, some are made on foot, some might be made on by a ride, or because they can get those chain trips can get quite complex. We have done a study on the mobility of the matatu, which is the minibus system of transport public in Nairobi, in Kenya. And we saw how women do one more trip than men on average per day, and those trips are between 30 and 40 minutes each. So this can be really complex and difficult trips to do, to keep up and be able to do all the needed things during the day, implying also that sometimes some things are not done because it's impossible in the 24 hours of the day with the transportation modes available and the economic resources available to individuals and families. So the geographical scope is also smaller. The age of voluntary cessation of driving is women stop driving when they see that they are a danger. For men, it's very difficult to assume that they cannot drive because of some physical functioning impairment. Safety has different implications for women and men. For instance, in the design of safety belts and the rates of injuries in car accidents are also different. Women are more victims about those who are killed by accidents as pedestrians. and the ergonomy of the cars, etc. There are also quite a bit of implications that I don't have the time now to go here in detail. So we see here that these different gender difference in transportation. I did a study for the Ministry of Public Works in Spain over 12 years ago. I did that. They asked me to do a gender analysis of the main transportation databases in Spain, those produced by the ministry itself and those produced by the regional governments in Madrid and in Catalonia. And after I had this, I identified quite a few gender biases in the way data were being collected. But then after a while, I realized that all this, the way that data are collected in transport statistics, which you can see on the left of this column, this is a rather standard categorization of trips: employment, study, shopping, leisure, strolling, escorting, visits, other. So after a while, I thought, well, all these trips that are under shopping, leisure, strolling, escorting, visits, many of those trips really are what, if we look from a gender perspective, could be called care trips, because they are related to what every people do to take care of other people and to take care of the household. So what about if we could give them a name to make them visible and to properly count them? Because if they are scattered in different, many smaller categories, you really don't see what's the size of care-related mobility. So I came up with this concept of mobility of care. And I did a very rough estimation, just totally, I did this totally without, I thought, well, maybe two-thirds of shopping trips are needed trips. They are not leisure shopping. It's shopping that you do because you need it to live. It's not something you do for because you want some nicer earrings, you see. So it's really, you need to buy, you need food, you need to clean the house, you need to buy a new washing machine. I don't know, things really needed. So let's say that maybe 2/3 of shopping trips are needed things. Let's say that maybe 1/3 of strolling is to accompany people who need to be accompanied, like elderly or the young or sick people. Escorting, I would say 100%, because when you escort someone, it's because the person cannot go autonomously. Either because they are under 18, they cannot drive, there's no public transportation, or they are elderly and they cannot drive any longer and there's no public transportation. So let's say 100%. And visits, let's say that 2/3 are just for enjoyment or personal visits, but 1/3 is because you are taking care of somebody who needs the visit. And let's say that in the black box, other 1/3 is also a needed thing. So I came up with this, and I would say, well, let's estimate, this is totally arbitrary. And it came out doing this, that it was 25% of all trips of the national, those are data from the Ministry of the Spanish Ministry of Public Works survey. So this was, as I said, totally arbitrary. So then I did get a student. I convinced her to do her PhD, to do a real study with a survey designed specifically to be able to really distinguish what trips were for personal or for enjoyment from those that were for taking care of persons or taking care of the home. So because the standard surveys do not collect the data this way, so you cannot really separate what trips are needed and what are superfluous. So we designed this specific new survey, and she applied it to the population in the region of Madrid between 30 and 45 years of age. And this is the result of this research. So for this segment of the population, which of course is the segment we chose it because it's a segment where people have younger kids, so where care responsibilities are probably more important, where people have to reconcile work and raising kids. So it's a very significant segment of the population. And the result was that employment trips were 33% of trips, and work-related trips were 29% of trips. And then when we looked at this from disaggregating by sex, the results were really more interesting still, because here you see the gender gap in care-related trips. So for women, women do 40% of care-related trips and 23% of employment. And for men, it's the gap is bigger because they only do 9% of care-related trips. So this shows how there is this great gender gap in use of transportation and what kind of trips it is that women do. So this is an example. Then we have done similar studies for a small city in northern Spain called Irún. We have done another for the users of a public train in the region of Buenos Aires, and another of the smaller bus system in Nairobi. We have also done 2 studies on gender and housing, one for the Ministry of Public Works in Spain, and another for the Basque government. The one for the Basque government has included specific recommendations requirements. It's not recommendations. They have become already into their legislation. This was what they asked us to do, was to do some recommendations to improve housing standards, because they were drafting a new housing legislation of housing standards, in legal standards for the Basque Country. So we recommended 4 or 5 things to introduce related to the sizes minimum sizes of bedrooms and kitchens, and also the distribution inside the house, and also storage space, and some issues about the design of common space within high-rise buildings. And this has been introduced into the housing legislation in the Basque Country. The study that we did for the national government was more of an overall study of what can be the gender implications for housing, and also it has recommendations on issues to look at that could be considered in different housing policies at different levels, either both from legislative and design point of view and financing point of views. We have worked and are working in a number of European projects. Many of these are related to promoting women in science and technology and promoting structural change of organizations to support gender equality, which is a whole area of funding within the European Commission. And we are now working in 2 of these, particularly Gender Academy, Gender Equality Academy, which is about creating educational resources to promote women in STEM areas, and also to support gender research and gender education in our fields of planning, architecture, and transportation. We are also working on the Gendered Innovations Project, which is, I sent you a link of this. This is a project funded by the European Commission with Stanford University. We have made the Spanish translation, and also we are now working in the 2nd edition of this project. We just finished a month ago, and well, in the middle of all this coronavirus crisis, so we expect that it will be online in the coming weeks, and it will have a number of new case studies in the area of planning and transportation. There will be a case study on gender in smart transportation and co-creation of transport solutions, and also there will be a case study on gender and public space that I have drafted, and another one on gender and climate change and waste management. We have also advised the several Spanish regions on how to introduce gender in their urban and land use legislation. The region of Extremadura, which has just approved a new land use and territorial planning law. In Spain, planning legislation is mostly a competence of regional governments. The national government has some competence, but quite reduced. So it's mostly the regions who do the legislation related to land use planning and territorial planning. So we have drafted a technical annex to the Extremadura law, which was approved last year. This a technical annex on how gender can be introduced into local, that means municipal level land use plans. In Spain, it's municipalities who approved comprehensive land use plans, and also territorial plans. The regions do also have regional plans. Some of them have a sectoral orientations, others have a spatial orientation to coordinate issues like infrastructure, nature preservation, and management of big infrastructures and things like that. We have also advised the Basque government on how to introduce gender into their regional plan. It's called territorial guidelines, that's what they call it. They had approved their territorial guidelines 22 years ago, and 2 years ago they did the revision after 20 years, and this is the document that we advised. And so they have introduced a whole section on how to introduce gender in some of the main areas of the territorial guidelines, particularly related to municipal planning and transportation, but also to rural areas, because the Basque Country has a very important rural and small towns and small villages landscape, and addressing gender issues in transportation and service provision in all those rural areas is also very, very important. We have advised a couple of municipalities on their urban sustainable mobility plans, one small city in Valencia and another one in northern Spain, Irún. And then we have been advising a very big redevelopment project in the north of Madrid. This is called Madrid Nuevo Norte. This is a big, you can see this infographic. No, it's a model. It's a picture of the model. It's a very big redevelopment project in all the old rail yards around the Estación de Chamartín, which is a big railway station, railway node in the north of the city. And the whole of this area is, for you to have an idea of the sense of the scope of this project, it's the size like La Défense in Paris or Canary Wharf in London. So it's a big redevelopment project, and we since in the last 10 years there has been quite a number of legislation on gender mainstreaming policies in Europe. This started with the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1998, which started talking about gender things, gender topics, and gender mainstreaming. And there was a piece of legislation coming from Europe on gender impact statements that had to be compulsorily introduced in national legislation. So this was translated to Spanish legislation in 2003, and to planning legislation in several regions, and into overall regional level legislation in several regions as a compulsory element. and because urban development plans in Spain are legislation. They technically they are pieces. They have this. They have the value of a law. So there has been this interpretation that they have this requirement. They have complied to the requirement of integrating a gender impact statement. So this has been started to be applied quite recently in the last 2 or 3 years, and we have been pioneering this work because we have been, in my team, and we are the first group of people who started working on gender in planning. So we have also been the first to start drafting these gender impact statements of plans of urban plans, and this project for Madrid Nuevo Norte, because it's a modification of the of the municipal plan of the city of Madrid. It has to comply to this requirement of having a gender impact statement. So we drafted this, and we have done this also for a smaller municipality in the west of Madrid called Boadilla del Monte. And we're also working the redevelopment of a square in the center of the city of Valencia. So I don't know, let me see how we are going with the time. Yeah, I will just show you maybe 10 minutes more, Vicente. How do you think?
I think it's okay.
It's okay. Okay, so let me just mention this other project, and then if we have the time, I will go a little bit into the gender impact statement that we did for Madrid Nuevo Norte. We have also worked with ADIF. ADIF is the Spanish company. It's a public corporation that belongs to the Ministry of Public Works, and it's the owner and manager of all railway stations in the country. So they are the owners of train stations, a normal train, but also the high-speed train stations. And they asked us to do for the first time a gender analysis of the projects that they were developing for these 3 high-speed train stations, which have very different urban settings. One of them is a big one in a big city, San Sebastián, Donostia. Another one is in the middle of nowhere. It's like in the country, and it has an issue of how the railway, how you can cross. So let me see, where is this? I had added, well, I had added the 3 images of this, but somehow they are not in. Oh, well. Well, let me see if I can show them to you, if I can open this. Well, let me finish, and then I will, I will show you a couple of slides of the work we have done on how to introduce gender topics in these 3 different train stations, addressing issues like safety and services and signaling and the crossing, and also addressing issues during construction work, because these works take a long period of time, and particularly in this one, which is traversing an area in which the cross movements are important, and what are the implications in terms of safety during work and once the infrastructure is completed. So I have already mentioned this G Academy project, and this will produce some online resources. And we also do something that I like a lot, which is exploratory walks with women. This is a methodology that was developed originally in Canada, in Toronto and Montreal, on how to identify safety concerns, because women have specific sensitivity of how a location is safe or unsafe because of the danger of the perceived danger of sexual assault. And so using this knowledge and experience of women and coupling it with technical analysis of plans and space, we have been doing this in several cities, and the results are quite interesting in terms of producing recommendations for cities. We have done with the city of Madrid in several locations, and we have produced specific recommendations on how to do some redevelopment projects, taking into account what women were suggesting, the women who live in those neighborhoods. We participate in quite a few networks. One of them is the UN Habitat Gender Hub, which is a hub of universities that work on gender. We also participate in GADUS Group, which is a network of planners and academics who work on gender issues in Europe. And I was chair of the COST network, Gender ST, for 4 years. This was a big project funded by the European Commission, in which we did all these activities with over 200 people and 40 countries, and produced a number of policy papers and international conferences and publications. We do this series of engendering that have also produced a number of, for instance, the book that Vicente was mentioning before is mainly a result of one of these conferences, and a number of publications that I can also send you some references. Those addressing planning and transportation and architecture, and those addressing participation and promotion of women in STEM areas. Oh, here they are. The urban nucleus are very small and very sparse. So how do you make the design of the high-speed rail in ways that don't distort too much the crossings, and how to ensure that these crossings are safe? And this is just very briefly, the gender impact assessment that we did for the project Madrid Nuevo Norte, which is, we did a consultancy during the design. This project was designed by Rogers, and the engineering firm was Obispo. And we were working together with the teams in a big open office space in which were the people, the developer, the architectural teams from Rogers, the engineering teams from Arup, and from many other engineering firms, because this is a huge engineering project with lots of engineering implications. You see, the project has 10,500 housing units. 20 of them at least will be social housing, with this a total of over 1 million square meter of housing floor area, and a big central business district. This is the land use plan. With you see here the new train station. Currently these are rail yards that will be covered, and a park will be built over them. This will be done without trains stopping, so it's a huge engineering challenge on how to cover this. This is a big highway, a ring road in the city of Madrid that goes around the city, and so you see the project involves the redevelopment of this underused space. The CBD will be in this part, and the yellow is the residential. So we did these activities with them. We did ad hoc training to the technical office. We worked with the social engagement and communication departments of the development company and with the managers. We did the consultancy and technical assistance during the design process and also for the gender impact assessment. We worked in social inclusion with the neighboring neighborhoods, because some of the neighboring neighborhoods of these big problems are middle class, but some are lower middle class, and some are neighborhoods with quite significant social issues and high unemployment rates and so on. So we did exploratory walks with women and workshops and meetings with the women in those neighborhoods. And then we also worked in the communication and dissemination of all these activities. So the impact assessment has like 5 parts. One which addresses the overall structure of the project of the master plan, and then 4 others that address, because the project is divided into 4 smaller areas. So we analyzed these 4, they are called APES, areas. We did the analysis for each of the 4 individual areas. So we looked at the issues from a gender point of view of the overall urban structure, how of the linkages with the neighborhoods, and how the locations, for instance, of facilities in relationship to the and other facilities that have specific gender implications with the needs of the neighborhood or the neighboring areas, and again within the project itself. Mobility and transportation, the measures to support intermodal public transportation network, the private car deterrent measures, the support to active mobility, which is a very important thing from the point of view of women, because most of physical exercise for women is walking. So everything that supports pedestrian movement is key for women's health, particularly for elderly women's health, and also to keep good health for the elderly. So we did this analysis of accessibility to the different stops of the different transportation that is included in the proposal. There are several new subway stops. There's a high-speed bus. There are normal buses, and how the CBD and the housing relates, and the accessibility. The alternative pedestrian routes, safety and security, the urban space, the care support, the distribution, proportional and hierarchy of green areas, and the pedestrian routes, the safety, and how we did recommendations on what was possible to regulate within the particular planning document, because legally specific technical planning documents can regulate certain things and not others. Those are referred to more detailed planning techniques. So when some things that would require regulation to ensure, for instance, safety issues related to lighting, that couldn't be regulated by the planning document in case, we drafted within the text that these things should be developed in the further, more detailed planning documents to follow along the implementation process of the master plan. And we did that, for instance, in the case of lighting, but also in the case, for instance, of the length of facades, of continuous facades of blocks. When blocks, for instance, and fences and ground floors, and the uses of the ground floor to ensure greater activity at ground floor level, so as to promote that as much as possible public space is used on a regular basis throughout the day, even on weekends, even at the CBD. So we did all this kind of analysis and worked with the technical teams on how to integrate these aspects into the possibilities of each of the technical planning documents. So then we also did this very detailed analysis of the everyday urban facilities, how they respond to the care needs of elderly and the young, and Mm, well, I don't think I can go into all this detail. I will just show you, just to finish, just to give you an idea of what of what of the kind of work that we did. For instance, there was one very big block that was very long, and it was not possible to get a street that would cut this very long facade. So what we did was to introduce in the regulation a way that would make it compulsory that a passage, not a street, but a passage would cut the long facade in the middle of this big block, even if it was not a proper street. So this is built into the master plan, you see, to avoid long blocks without the possibility of getting away, which is one of the criteria for safe urban design, safe design of public space. So I think I will finish it here because it's just too detailed to go into the detail. And yeah, okay, I will leave it here, and maybe you can just maybe I will go out of this. And
Inés,
yeah.
thank you. That was very nice. I mean, we got a lot of comments on the chat, and I think people probably will have to want to ask you questions.
Okay.
But that was very enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So perhaps just that's open for questions and answers. Because if you have questions, just turn your mic on because I can see everybody and just speak. Let's do a conversation here. So I think Amir, please go ahead.
Hi, Inés. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very informative and interesting, especially the beginning of your presentation when you talk about the transportation patterns and how you restructure the classes of travel behavior and then specify the caregivers travel pattern was very interesting for me. I was wondering, I mean, that finding, how it has been used in the planning, in the transportation planning or practice, and what kind of application or implementation or policies you can think of that can be extracted from that finding. And my second question is related to toward the end of your presentation when you talk about more urban design practices through the lens of gender. Many design suggestions or recommendation that you was proposed, I could have seen them as a general, like, good urban design practice, like provide safety, accessibility, pedestrian oriented. So my question is, why is it important that we talk about those like good urban design practices necessarily through the lens of gender when it's a universal recommendations?
Well,
Inés, sorry, just interrupt you. Can everybody turn the cameras on? Because it's pretty uncomfortable for the speaker not to see people. Thank you, Amir. Sorry.
Okay, Amir. Yeah. Okay, now I see you, Amir. Yes. Okay, so responding to the first question, I did this study for the Ministry of Public Works in 2008. Then there was a change of government, so the people who received my research was a different team from a different political party, and they couldn't care less, so they didn't look at it. So 5 years later, I got this into the Gender Innovations Project of the European Commission. And because this European project of the European Commission was co-hosted by the University of Stanford, people started looking at it, only because it was the University of Stanford, not because of the... And so the Inter-American Development Bank called me. And then UN Habitat called me. And then people started calling me for that because it came out into the European Commission and the University of Stanford project. And so it's, let's say that the concept, it's new. I invented it 12 years ago. People have started looking at it maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, not longer than that. And then it takes a lot to get things into policy. And to change viewpoints and to change people's minds. And engineering is a very, well, I don't know if you're engineers, but some of you maybe are engineers, but engineers, when they see things clearly, they act on it, but they have to, so it's still to move into changing things. For the moment, it's only into research also for public administrations, because we have done these studies for several cities, but for the moment we have done the studies, and those studies are very recent. They are from last year. So let's see what they do from them. Again, now what will happen with the coronavirus? Because the coronavirus will pose important challenges to public transportation unless it gets out of the picture, or unless the vaccines function, which is not obvious. They will function because it seems immunity is not very high. So let's see what's going to happen with the coronavirus and public transportation. This is a big thing. I have no idea. We'll see. So that regarding the first thing. Then regarding the second thing, this is something that people always say, oh, this is good planning. No, it is not good planning. First, good planning is not done anywhere, that to begin with. So we know we produce as academic all these recommendation on what good planning is, but then this is not what institutions do. This is not what cities do. Sometimes it is, but often it's not. And then when you bring the gender lens into all these things, it's not exactly what regular planning design books say. Regular planning design books, I mean, I have not been able to go into the details of this gender impact statement that we did for the Madrid Nuevo Norte project, because it's like 200 pages. So I just gave like an overall, when you really look at what women as users demand, it goes beyond to what normal planning design. Normal planning design says, yes, you have to look at safety, but it's not. When you ask the women, it's different. And we are seeing this when we do the exploratory walks with the women who live there, who know their neighborhoods. They know, for instance, we found out that one woman was taking the subway every day, and when she looked at the plan in the workshop we did with them, she looked at the plan, she saw there was a subway stop much closer to her house. She never used that subway stop. She had not ever realized that stop was closer to her house. Do you know why she didn't use it? Because she felt unsafe going through those blocks. So for her, the normal thing was going every day 15 minutes more to the other one, because that's where she was feeling safe. So this brings something that planners don't necessarily know when they design things, because planners don't have this sensitivity to what safety is from the point of view of when you can get sexually attacked or harassed. And this is something that the women who live in the neighborhoods know very differently. And the results of asking to the women that we got were quite different from what the proposals were being made from the best designers that were working the project, you see. So that's looking at safety, but also when you look at facilities. What are the facilities that you have for taking care of kids and the elderly? Is this necessarily, this is getting out very crudely today with the coronavirus as well. If you look at that, most of the deaths come from elderly homes. And what's the housing solutions that our planning and our policy system has produced for taking care of the elderly? that has become so fragile when things under this emergency situation, but it's not only the emergency situation. In those places, people are not well taken care of on a regular basis. Only the coronavirus has exaggerated and brought to light underlying issues that were already there, and that you can only identify properly if you look from a gender perspective, which is, what do we do to take care of people? How do architectural and planning takes this into account? Okay, and this is not something that is normally considered in regular urban design
Inés,
practice.
For instance, I can't raise my hand, and also Hema has sent me an email. She can't raise her hand either, so and she had a question.
Inés, thank you so much. And I'm waiting for a 12 o'clock call first, so I really pushed my way in to talk to you. I really enjoyed your talk, and thank you for remembering Dolores's contribution, because Dolores Hayden, because I think she really sparked off this whole movement.
She was the first one.
She was great, and I was at UCLA when she started finishing up her Grand Domestic Revolution book, and she's a friend and really very, very wonderful sort of leader in this area. I'm very interested in the work that you're doing overall, because it is so difficult to get to policy. And I think Weckerle's work in Toronto, when they got the first genderized plan, was really path-breaking, and it's opened up the door for so many, people to work in this area too. That it's policy as well as theory. It really seems important at this point, I think, to try and pull together the case evidence. You've done a great job of showing us cases. And I think the proof of the pudding about what's working is so localized that these cases have a lot of merit. And I wish you'd consider doing something like the women in housing sort of issues. Back in '92, I did a conference at Michigan, which was called Shelter Women in Development. And it brought forth so many interesting things that people were doing to make that access to shelter for women better, easier, stronger, and all the things that I think, we've moved away. We have come far in the area now. It's kind of mainstream to talk about women's specialized needs for housing, for instance. But I wish somebody with your energy would take up hosting an international conference. I don't want to do it at this point in my life, but I would love it if your people would like to embrace this idea and pull together something on the issue of women in shelter and its implications.
When we did the work for the Basque government, this was it had an incredible public reaction. All the conservative press it was incredible. We were on all the main programs on TV, on all the news, on all the press. Incredible attacks, because there was a minimum size of kitchens, and because it was mostly the issue of putting a minimum size of kitchens. So the conservative journalist started saying the Basque government wants to send men to the kitchen. Which was not at all what was. So we got this incredible attack by the press, and everything that was included was so reasonable. It was minimum size for all housing of bedrooms, minimum size of storage space, safe design of common space in buildings, a minimum size of kitchens, and some recommendations of the relationships between the kitchen and the dining room and the living room, so as to facilitate the work and reduce the isolation of the person who is in the kitchen. But the reaction was incredible. So yeah, I guess that it's like you mentioned the word women, gender, and some people get a bit but now again the coronavirus is bringing, because in Spain we have the most strict confinement measures probably in the world. I'm living it at a distance, but I'm seeing it from my family and friends there. Because housing standards in Spain are not like here. Houses are small. They are mostly apartments, not houses. So people don't have an open space, and they have been already now a month and a half without going out in small spaces. No gardens, no terraces, nothing to have fresh air. So there's a huge housing issue when you have to work from home, when you have kids in the home, when you have an elderly person, when someone gets sick and you have to get the isolation of this. So yeah, looking at, so all the care things, it's like are exacerbated to and housing, and I also think that something that's coming up is that with the big economic crisis that is coming, many people won't be able to afford a house any longer in any way. So common ways of sharing, common community ways of living will have to be thought about. How to share. I don't know how this is going to happen, but I foresee that this will have, that many people won't be able to afford individual homes. Yeah.
Hey, Bill has a question, and we got the space reserved in Zoom till 12:30, so I don't know what's going to happen 12:30. We might be kicked out.
Yeah, Vicente, thank you. Don't worry, you can keep the space as long as you want. It doesn't stop you. The Zoom doesn't cut you off.
Good.
You have to cut yourself off. It's just a marker. Well, thank you very much for coming and sharing your work with us. That's the first thing I want to say. I appreciate that, and I will write Michael Newman a big thank you for recommending that we get in touch with you. My question is, how would you see, in California, we have a big interest in climate adaptation in different ways. And we have something called the Strategic Growth Council in California, who's putting a lot of money into different research. And some of it is for disadvantaged communities, and which actually there's a website in California, you can look it up on called Environ Screen 3, and they have all the ones in California. You can see them all on this one map, so you don't even have to do much research. You just go to one site, and the state has done it. But how do you frame the sort of women's issues around climate adaptation in the long term? Some of them is clearly public health, some of them is air pollution, and some of it is transportation. But because in non-urban areas in California, the women's relation to transportation is different than in the urban sector. How would you formulate a kind of a research approach dealing with climate adaptation?
Yeah, well, you mentioned quite a few. I think waste management is another one, because waste management done in the homes, how it's done in the homes and how it is done professionally by the city, the waste. I think that, and then there is food production and food and food consumption. There are important gender issues in food consumption mostly. It seems that would have to be seen here, of course, but it seems that there's a preference among women of using more ecological products than among men, and of consuming less meat, which is one big source of climate issues. So I would say that food is one. Transportation is another. Transportation planning, patterns, and transportation modes, private versus private, public modes, and patterns, obviously, and then waste, and then maybe. Disasters. I don't know about, because here you have earthquakes and you have fires. Sometimes you have had fires recently, and the literature on disasters in third world countries have found out great gender differences in the impact of natural disasters. I don't know of if any such research has been done here, but because women take care of those who cannot take care of themselves, they have different responses in situations of risk. And also there are cultural patterns maybe related to immigrant populations or even to religious groups in terms of, that's also research in other countries that I don't know what relevance could have or not here with your mix of ethnicity and of what women do or not according to their cultural and or religious backgrounds that might be still alive here in that kind of situations. So looking at the different responses in situations of disaster that have care issues and cultural and religious maybe implications, and also socioeconomic implications. For instance, access to economic resources, single parent homes, which are mostly headed by women and are particularly vulnerable. So looking at the intersectionality of gender and other variables like income, having or not a partner, having or not kids, and also age, and then again health. I don't know if there are issues of preconditions, a gender analysis of health preconditions that might be related to climate. That would be another important thing to look at. And here this would have to be crossed to access to the public health system, which is a big issue because so many people don't have health care, and because healthcare is related to employment, to see what's the rate of employment, the gendered patterns of employment, and related to access to healthcare. I don't know that, and then this again crossed by ethnicity and age. And kids or not kids. So all these interrelations would have to be looked at because here those are big things or different from what we have, for instance, in Spain, where everybody has access to universal health and our ethnicity mix is much slower. So looking at those intersections would be important here, I think.
Thank you. No, I think that's a good answer, and also the rate at which, especially when you lose your house, whether it gets rebuilt,
exactly.
Who makes the decision about what gets rebuilt and how it's designed. There's absolutely no research in that area at all in California right now.
I'm raising my hand physically because I can't find the little button here for that. 3 questions, Inés, very fast. One is, Cal Poly has little landmarks in certain places that people can, with light, that people can press a button in emergencies. Have you thought of something like that in your project located in specifically dangerous areas where not only with a button for emergency, but the camera, so that women can, or anybody can have access to some kind of fast emergency service, especially in areas that are perceived as dangerous. The other one is, I might have missed, and you probably have that in your project recommendations, but one of the important things for women is that because they stay home longer than men, is to have educational possibilities close to the home, or even with a playground for the kids while they take a class in computers or something like that, close to the home. And the other, it's like a question. In Brazil recently, the subway company in Rio has established specific cars in the metro, in the subways, just for women.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just want to know if you know about that, because
Yes, I can tell you about that. Yes, yeah. Those are Mexico City has that. There are a number of cities that have this. They call them pink, like specific services for women. This is just like when you have a heart problem and you get una tirita. How do you call that? Those measures can help some women at some time, particularly when sexual harassment is so obvious and so bad. So you have these two sections of the train where you can go and you won't be harassed. But those has to be temporary, because this doesn't solve the issue. It's just like a very small thing. It doesn't address the core issue, which is in part it's cultural, in part it has to address many other aspects of why harassment is so prevalent in public transportation in certain countries, Latin American countries or India, Egypt have been in point. This doesn't solve the issue. It only makes it a bit better for some in some places, and it has unintended and secondary effects, which might be, for instance, in Mexico City, they have had this for decades now. And because they have this, they think it's solved, and they don't do more, or they don't address the core things that should really. And then also there's a point. I was last year in Mexico City at a conference organized by the government, and I heard that in one study that they have found out that many men think that because these two vehicles are for women, all the others are just for them. And so the women are not welcome in the remaining part. And so it creates all sorts of secondary unintended and negative effects. So it's something that, well, maybe can raise attention that there's an issue, but then if you don't do other things, it can be counterproductive. So it's something that you really need to take care how you manage this. And you have to manage it with a lot of careful care, and not thinking that this is the way to go. So, and then the other two things about surveillance mechanisms in public space. This is an issue that raises in Europe, where we have all this guarantee of privacy. And that now it's again being challenged with all the crisis that we're living. You cannot record in public space, where we have that kind of mechanism, for instance, in the subway in Spain, but this is a normal thing. The subway has it. It doesn't have anything to do with gender or anything. The subway has these buttons that you can press in case of danger. And I have never recommended anything about surveillance in any of my projects. I haven't thought of it, really. I think it's an intrusion in public life. Spanish cities are probably among the safest in the world, again, for reasons that have to do with urban design, with the capacity, with the number of people, with the fact that it's a quite cohesion society. So it doesn't compare to LA, or it doesn't compare to New York, it doesn't compare to Latin American cities. So it doesn't compare to what you can do on campus, because campuses here in America are self-contained infrastructures that are managed by the university with their own police. So you can implement measures that legally you cannot implement in open public space in Europe, for instance. So I would say that surveillance.
I didn't suggest public surveillance. I was thinking of if you have one landmark where it's kind of the danger zone that people get there to press a button or to speak with somebody, that would be controlled with the camera, because
Okay.
if somebody's there, it's because it's an emergency.
Okay, I see. Sorry. Then I misunderstood.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that could be a solution. Yeah, it could. We have never thought of that, but that could be an option in certain. Yeah.
Oh, maybe I should copyright it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And sorry, the other question you did, I didn't get it well.
About educational opportunities for women close to home, so they can maybe take their kids. I see that happening in favelas, for instance, in Brazil, where women stay at home a lot, taking care of the kids, and sometimes with small social opportunities like, oh, I can take a couple of hours here, I can take a computer class or something next to home.
Yes. Well, in our Spanish case, in our Spanish context, this is not so much the issue, because education is very equal in Spain now. Even women are more educated than men, also at a higher educational level. There are more women who graduate from universities than men. So the reality is that in many countries, women are overeducated. They have more education that is needed for their jobs, and in fact, they are underemployed for the education that they have. But then, if you go to other contexts like the favelas, then yes, those are issues to look at. So in every context, you look at the context, and
Kelly has a I think she's she just left. People have other meetings. Sorry. I'm getting a lot of great presentation chats here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
We got 3 people remaining. Do we have any more questions? If not, Inés is probably.
I have something. Right. I'm sorry that Kelly left, but we teach a course, undergraduate course here called Planning for Multiple Publics, where issues of gender are included and discussed in the different kind of shelter needs and roles are put forth. It would be nice if you could send us maybe a small bibliography of what are the 10 best readings. All right, not 50 pages. Students won't read them all, but I mean 10 good ones, so then we can try to acquire them, or we now actually have the rights to some books, ebooks that the university buys the rights to them, so we can put those in class as free books. Which is very nice. So then you can say, here, read chapter here, and that wasn't available now. So and this becomes more important now that we have teaching, virtually or digitally, because you can't send this. It's hard to send the student to the library. They don't go that way, except for a coffee. The library was very good here because they had a space that was open 24 hours a day in our library. So I would think that was very good. So if you could do that, that would be
absolutely.
a very important thing. And if there comes a time and you're still in Los Angeles when when you can freely go around California, we do have in our county actually one project that was built 25 years ago. That's a cooperative housing space where people buy the units, but they cook collectively and things like that. The only one that we have. But I think also the other issue that needs more research now, because of the coronavirus event, you know, is the gender issues in, you know, in retirement and elderly homes and stuff, which are not clearly understood at all, because they're in California. There's a whole series of this. A lot of them run by private, but a lot of them run by nonprofit church groups. The Lutherans own maybe 10 or 12 of these throughout California, and their behavior, we you know, we have to look at this more, because women live longer. So these are predominantly, you know, places of women's shelter in the end.
Yes.
And so that there's still a lot to do, but so that would be helpful to us. Small, 10 items, not.
Yeah.
Yes, I will.
Yeah. Actually, Bill, you raised an equality issue. Why do women live longer than men? I want to live as long as women.
That's because they have more exercise doing all this work that was presented in this research early on. 40% of their time is, you know, taking care of people. Their primary way of mobility is walking. I mean, they're in better condition because at home you're having caipirinha, and then you say, "Where's my feijoada?" Right?
But it's being reduced. The gap is being reduced.
Beate, do you have a question, Beate?
I don't have a question, but
Okay.
I just have to say that Corona for me is doing good, because it's coming exactly down to what you said in the beginning. I have 3 kids and I have so much more time right now because I don't have to drive around all the time. So public transportation, if that would exist here, would really make my life a lot easier, because suddenly I could send out my kids with public transportation to all the places where they need to, as I was used to when I still lived in Stuttgart. So there's, you know, there are a lot of things you addressed, which I can totally see, and which you speak out of my heart. So I hope you come to Slough at some point and we can talk in person. That would be
I
great.
would love to. I hope I will be able before, but who knows when this is going to open.
Yeah. I think it doesn't look good so far, but yeah. I mean, thank you so much, Inés. It was fantastic. You raised so many important questions, especially because the most important question for me was that I have to fight to live as long as my wife then. Equal rights. But thank you very much. Yeah, I hope we can host you here personally. I mean, I wouldn't say that you would like the wine here, because the wine in Spain is probably much better, but the region here is beautiful. So
I love it. I love it here. Yeah. So, but you know, I have my return ticket to Spain for August 31st, and I have strong doubts that flights will be restored by the date. So I am a bit concerned about that.
Yep. I have some
we'll see.
Similar issue.
Yeah, we'll see.
But thanks very much, and I'll try to get this transcribed and made into a little article and send back to you for your approval, because a lot of people are going to be wanting to read that. Some people already asked me if they can have access to your PowerPoint.
Yes, I will send it. Yes.
Be great. And thanks so much again. We love it.
Okay. Thank you to you. It's been my pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you so much to all. It's been a pleasure. Great pleasure.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.